and the government should be ashamed.
If the member is seeking a call, then she must do so, and I would refer her to Speaker's Ruling 25(2). I call the Honourable Member Jan Logie.
Thank you. The stated purpose of this bill is to amend the Immigration Act to enhance New Zealand's ability to deter people smuggling to New Zealand. The Green Party will be opposing this bill as its purpose is opaque and it seems to contravene international and domestic human rights obligations. I'd like to initially look at what we know about people smuggling in New Zealand before we get and some of the principles that seem to be behind the thinking of this bill before getting into the details of the proposal. So from 2004 to 2010, 15 people were convicted of people smuggling within New Zealand. And none of those cases, to my knowledge, involved mass arrivals. The people convicted of people smuggling under Section 98 of the Crimes Act have been treated pretty leniently by our courts, actually, with the harshest penalty in recent years being 8 months home detention. So that's a sign of how seriously our country takes people smuggling. 8 months home detention as the strongest response. Surely, if people smuggling was an issue in this country, or even if we thought it might become one, then the most appropriate response would be to look at our identification of smugglers and response to them, not penalising the victims of that smuggling. It seems the bizarrest response imaginable to me. The way this is framed, to me, is a little bit like trying to deter burglars by promising to punish the people whose houses get burgled. It doesn't make sense. So it seems to me we can't really consider this as an intervention or a deterrent against people smuggling because it's got nothing to do with the smugglers. So let's then consider some of the Minister's comments when he announced the legislation to see if there are other clues to the purpose. So when announcing it, he said, "The recent events in Darwin show that New Zealand is a target for dangerous and illegal mass arrivals by boat. We need to be prepared." He's also made mention of a freighter of 500 people that made it to Canada a few years ago. Yet the government itself states there is no intelligence at the moment that would suggest a group of boat people is on its way. There's never been a landing of illegal immigrants in New Zealand by boat, with the journey being considered too dangerous for people smuggling operations to attempt. And also I'd like to draw attention too to the cost of fuel. And if we're talking about this dystopic future where things are going to get worse and more people are going to be coming to New Zealand, we also need to factor in the increasing price of oil that's going to make that option of getting this far that much more difficult. And within that cost, the refugees have to factor in the cost of the boat, which would be confiscated on arrival. So it would be to require a big freighter like in Canada to get this far, and they'd have to afford that. It's not likely. Immigration figures showed a decade ago that about 2,500 asylum seekers were arriving in New Zealand every year, mostly by plane. Almost all of them were refused residency, and the numbers have plummeted and have since flatlined at around 250 per annum. And these have been further reduced by advanced processing. The government is not just exaggerating the risk of mass invasion by boat people, this government is creating the idea of a risk. So I'd like now just to talk a little bit more about the reality of refugees in the world, because that's ultimately who we're talking about. The world's largest source of countries for refugees include Afghanistan, Iraq, Sierra Leone, and some of the countries hosting the most refugees include countries like Pakistan, Syria, Jordan, Iran, and Guinea. Approximately 70% of the world refugee population is in Africa and the Middle East. And these people are escaping war, persecution, torture, and things most of us can't even imagine. And here we are, drumming up a sense of them being a threat to us. It's a joke, and it's an offensive joke. Imagine yourself alone or with your family fleeing for your life and then being treated as a threat and a danger to the citizens of the country you'd made it to. To make it to New Zealand by a boat would be an epic feat. And in fact, I'd go so far as to say that a few years ago, in earlier times, someone capable of such a feat would have been the subject of great books and poems. Their bravery would have given us all inspiration because of the lesson and the tenacity of the human spirit and our ability to cope through extreme hardship. And yet, this government is choosing to demonise these people and treat them as a threat. Worldwide, there are about 11 to 12 million recognised refugees, but less than 1% are offered resettlement to a third country. Desperation is a natural response to that reality. I'd also just like to address the issue of illegal migrants, which has been used by the government. And this term's problematic because for several reasons. One, because it criminalises the person rather than the act of entering a country illegally. But also, it just shows a complete misunderstanding around the reality of refugees. Because international law recognises that refugees may need to enter a country without official documents or authorisation. That's part of the reality of being a refugee. And similarly, a person without status may have been coerced by traffickers and should be recognised as a victim of crime and not treated as a wrongdoer, which is what this legislation is seeking to do. Refugees and asylum seekers and people wanting to come to New Zealand are not queue jumpers and are not illegal migrants. If the government truly wanted to address the issue of refugee desperation, then surely the most compassionate and possibly definitely most sensible approach would be to improve processing of refugees and seek to get more places for refugees to be resettled in, and to reduce the levels of war that we have in the world, so there is less need for people to escape their countries. So now to talk quickly about some of the specific changes in this bill, where it seeks for mass detention and processing of arrivals. This, according to the Minister, will enable Immigration New Zealand to be able to focus on managing the immediate risks rather than being tied up in paperwork and clogging up the courts. You know, efficiency's good, but group detention is contrary to the fundamental concepts of law and fairness. And already Doris de Brez from the Human Rights Commission has noted that mandatory detention on the basis of group warrants raises issues of reasonableness and ultimately is probably amount to an arbitrary detention, breaching Section 22 of the New Zealand Bill of Rights Act. And according to Professor Max Abbott, the director of AUT University Centre for Migrant and Refugee Research, this is also probably a breach in international humanitarian laws and conventions. So this is what this government's about. It's about solutions for problems that don't exist and a complete denial of the importance and the validity of fundamental human rights. Shame. Shame on this government.
I call the honourable member